jungle rain had no beginning or end. It grew like foliage from the sky, branching and arching to the earth. Sometimes in solid thickets, entangling the islands, and other times in tendrils of blue mist, curling out of coastal clouds. The jungle breathed an eternal green that fevered men until they dripped sweat the way rubbery jungle leaves drip the monsoon rain. Leslie Marmon Silko. Welcome to Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone who's continued keeping up with the podcast so far, and for those that have been providing feedback, I do thank you very much as well. And again, I'd like to apologize for some of the audio issues in the last episode. It was very frustrating, but thankfully it seems like everything has been resolved and is working much, much better this week. So hopefully this episode won't have too many issues and it won't frustrate me and I can deliver a much better episode. And on that note, let's go ahead and get into kind of what we're going to be focusing on this week. So I covered India kind of in general, its geography and kind of the areas of it, and I didn't go too much into the people because, or at least not as in depth, as we will in future episodes, because we're still at a very kind of broad strokes. A lot of the people we're going to be talking about in this episode are very similar to the people in the last episode, and I kind of want to get into that a little by getting into some feedback that I received from the last episode, specifically in regards to the tribal societies that are in India today and were India at that time. And to do that, I'm going to focus mainly on the inhabitants of the Andamanese Islands, and thus kind of like the ancestors of the modern day Andamanese. One people that are part of the larger Andamanese group are the Sentinelese Islanders. There was a famous case from I think about 4 or 5 years ago of some missionary landing on their island illegally. India does allow these people to kind of keep to themselves, and he tried to proselytize to them, but they're very wary of outsiders due to a large number of historical factors, and they killed him, and unfortunately they were unable to retrieve the gentleman's body. The retrieval team was attacked as well, but thankfully none of them were injured. So just to kind of touch or kind of tie in these people with the people living around 10,000 BC. A lot of the Andamanese group has gone extinct, or they've kind of moved off the islands and just kind of integrated into other parts of India. It's not a very easy thing. There is a reserve for those Andamanese tribes people that have had constant contact. They kind of had their own tribal reservation or preserve. There's a very small number of them now. I'm not sure the exact number, but it's under 1,000. But I think from what we've been able to gather for kind of genetic testing, these people are kind of the baseline for what was living in a lot of India and the rest of Southeast Asia. And then, of course, due to their isolation, that's led them to develop dwarfism, because that's, for whatever reason, if you have an island population, dwarfism becomes a kind of just a fact of life. Animals of all types tend to be smaller, and that includes humans. And I mentioned in the Cyprus a couple of episodes ago that there were pygmy elephants and I think hippopotamuses as well on those islands, or that island, excuse me. So, they have that genetic feature that develops due to isolation and just due to kind of adaptation You being on a smaller landmass, you probably want to take up less size generally just to consume less and kind of make it easier to preserve your environment. And it should be noted that when those people sailed to those islands was quite a while back. I forget the exact date. I'm going to look it up here in just a moment. But it's not an easy trip. It's far longer from Cyprus to the mainland. I think to get to I think generally that chain is about, it's like 130 kilometers, which is about 80 something miles. So it's not an easy trip when you're just using like dugout canoes. Of course, when they made that trip, it was during the last glacial maximum. So, or one of the last glacial maximums. I'm not sure if they know that for sure. But, so the islands were a little bit less covered with water, so they probably had slightly more land to live on. And of course, as the climate changed, they were pushed further inland. But they're, the people there still hunt or gather. They fish, of course. That's a huge part of their diet. And of course, I'm sure they have certain types of just, wild fruits and vegetables that they can kind of live on. But again, they are very close, genetically speaking, to the people that were living in India, Bangladesh, and the rest of southern Asia, minus the Aboriginal people of Indonesia and Australia. Basically, these are the descendants of the second wave of peoples to kind of make it to southern Asia. They had a little bit wider range than the first group of Homo sapiens that left Africa, generally falling along the coasts, as we talked about, from the Horn of Africa through the coasts of Arabia and then around the coasts of, southern India. And then, of course, when they made that journey, the water level was not nearly as high, and that led them to get to the kind of the super Australia continent, Sahul, via mix of land bridges, dugout canoes, things like that. And so those people, which we'll get to in future episodes, and I'm going to hold for a second to let this car go by. And we're back. I apologize for that. So yes, we'll get to the people that first got to Australia and those areas eventually. So the people that are populating Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and even also parts of, I think, Tibet, Nepal, things like that, they have common ancestry with the Indian people, minus what will be the hunter, or the first farmers and pastoralists, and then the later influx of other peoples. And there's very little, as far as I can tell, and again, my study of genetics is not the best because I'm not a geneticist, but from what I've been able to read from a few of the genetic studies, there's very little back migration from Southeastern Asia back into India. Any kind of future mixture, and also, there's very little migration from China to the south, at least in terms of large amounts. There is always some, of course, but any kind of newer DNA typically comes from either China or India into the region, rather than people going out and then bringing it back in themselves. And that's due to a number of factors, which of course we'll get into later, but at this point it's due to things like topography, geography, weather patterns, I'm sure, as well. The monsoons in this area can be very brutal, and I'm sure they're not fun to live in, especially if you don't have any kind of permanent shelters. So that's kind of, there's, I'm sure that these people all have different languages that they've been developing from each other. They all have their own cultures, like locally, but in terms of like genetics, they're very close to each other, minus any kind of interbreeding they may have had with the remaining Austronesians, or possibly, again, we talked about it, the Denisovans. There were a couple of different branches of that family of earlier branches of that Homo species. Again, they're probably well and dead by this point, but there's always the possibility that they contributed to some of the people in Southeast Asia and the rest of, like, possibly Austronesia or China. So that would have affected genetics as well. But generally speaking, they all share kind of a similar, like, tool culture. Though that is beginning to change. You do begin to see at this point in time a number of different subcultures kind of start to form. There are, I think in Vietnam specifically, or what is now Vietnam, there are a couple of different cultures that either exist or have existed up to this point, and they're beginning to give way to a couple of different newer cultures. The Albanian, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. That's the English term for it. It's obviously a direct translation from a Vietnamese term, which I believe was Van Hoa Hoa Ben, which is kind of, they were like the big Mesolithic tool culture in China, or I'm sorry, in Vietnam, from about 13 to about 13,000, or I'm sorry, 13,000 BC to about 10,000 BCE. And so this is kind of the end point for them, and then you get to see a couple of different newer cultures kind of branching off from that. I think Bakson is one, and the other is Quyun Van is another. They may have overlapped. The Quyun Van may have succeeded the Baksun. It's kind of hard to tell, and unfortunately, I was not able to find a lot of good English sources for this. I ran into a lot of French sources, but unfortunately, my knowledge of the French language is very, very limited, much less being able to read that. And then, of course, Vietnamese is well outside of my wheelhouse, unfortunately. I am looking to try to get some better English sources for future episodes, but yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. It should be noted that also the people living in the Southeast Asian part of the world, they had a much wider range as well. There are some of those cultures I mentioned that they have overlaps with places in the very, very south of modern day China. So there's a lot going on, and these peoples will remain and form very orderly and very well maintained tribal societies for quite a while, until again they run into issues with more agricultural societies. But that's not to say they don't develop their own agricultural societies. There is evidence that they have that they begin to work with types of almonds or peas, gourds, and peppers. Peppers are very important. Cucumbers as well. So this is going to be a very big hotbed for kind of different kinds of wet agriculture or wet horticulture, as opposed to like dry wheat horticulture. And again, this is very early. It's very rudimentary. It's not true agriculture yet, but they're beginning to develop, kind of selective harvesting and breeding, I'm sure, or not necessarily breeding, but selective harvesting of certain types of crops. They're being more judicious in what they pick, and I'm sure that they might try to begin to experiment how things grow or why things grow where. This is kind of in a very good region to practice that. Um, now, there is the question, of course, of rice. I think right now most of the scholarship leans towards rice being introduced from outside of this area, um, and then from what is now China, or rather, I should say, rice agriculture was introduced from what is now southern China, specifically the Yangtze River. Um, though there is a question of what variety was first grown there and where that potentially came from. It's possible that those early findings are kind of they actually transported it from another location and grew it there initially, and then they developed one or two of the types of Asian rice that are now grown. Indica and Japonica is the other one, I believe. So it's possible that there was some type of wild rice growing in this area as well. And then once those more, we'll say, engineered crops came along, that they kind of supplanted the local variety. But again, current, I think, genetic studies of rice show that, and archaeological stuff show that it was first deliberately planted as like an agricultural means. That was in southern China. I think parts of southeastern Tibet and I think kind of the Burma, Cambodia region were also kind of in the running, but I think right now most of the evidence does suggest Chinese origin for rice, deliberate rice cultivation. Now, as for what languages these people are speaking, again, we probably saw a division very early of a few different tongues. I think if you look at a linguistic map of languages spoken in the region today, it's a little complicated and probably not very indicative of what people are speaking at this point in time. I imagine a lot of the places today that do speak Austroasiatic languages would be speaking so places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, parts of Thailand, and then of course Malaysia. I do think they would be speaking kind of a very early form of those, like of the proto language for that reason, Proto-Austroasiatic, whatever that is. I think in places like kind of the western end of Myanmar, kind of on the border between Bangladesh, Bhutan, I think there you might see kind of the proto Dravidian, possibly. Whereas in the very north of kind of Myanmar and kind of the southeast of what is now Tibet, and kind of like kind of the very kind of southwestish, what is now Yunnan in China. I think there you're probably seeing more proto Tibeto-Burman languages, and of course those are part of like the larger like Sino language families. But at that point, it's so hard to say because there's so much diversity in terms of those regions. And again, there's a lot of division just due to mountain ranges. I think probably like most of the rivers have their own kind of language groups around them. The Mekong, obviously, famously long, goes right down the Southeast Asian highlands, and then of course, what is now Myanmar, you also have the Irrawaddy River. So I think at this point in time, you've got a mix of Proto-Austro, Asian, and possibly like a Proto Sino language kind of in the far north, and possibly like a kind of Adamanese language, or maybe even kind of Proto-Dravidian. It's just so hard to say. And it should be noted that at this point in time, there's probably not a whole lot of people in this region. Again, I know a number of times in this run-up that we're not talking about a large number of humans, but I think in this area, especially just due to the nature of the weather, and just the rainforests in this region and the mountains, it's probably very hard to live here. In fact, you're not going to see a population boom in this region until heavy rice agriculture shows up. But once that happens, the flooding, the rains, that all helps tremendously to produce a massive amount of food, among other things, and that kind of offsets the difficulties and dangers of living in the region. But that being said, I think this is a good place to kind of leave Southeast Asia. Very interesting kingdoms. I've started kind of get the research of this bunch of regions now at the kind of the early Bronze Age. So I am looking forward to it. Oh, speaking of bronze, that reminds me. Ceramics are not in this region for another little while. They're in that kind of pre-pottery, pre-ceramic transitory period that we see still in the Middle East in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Different groups of people, but they don't have pottery yet. Where we'll be going next time, though, north into what is now China, these people do have the earliest pottery, and we'll be going into a little bit more in-depth discussion of them. Then I'm going to kind of cover the central part of Asia, stuff that we've kind of already actually touched on a little bit, and then of course we'll end after that. We'll probably do one more episode in the far western edge of Asia, right on the Indo-European steppe, or the Eurasian steppe, excuse me, and then we'll proceed to go to I think Australia. We'll cover the Australian peoples after that, and then I'll decide if we'll either go to the Americas or Europe afterwards. So I'm still kind of doing a little bit of research. But yeah, I hope everyone has enjoyed making this episode and the previous ones. I hope you continue to listen. But other than that, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you, and goodbye.